These are also important references. But we also need to move beyond these sort of historical accounts that are based on significant individuals like Michael Lynch or Tim McCaskill to recover much more collectively and socially and activist-orientedly the many voices, the many varied, diverse, complex, plural voices of people and their narratives that were involved in AIDS activism during this period of time. And I'm just going to sort of end off with this slide and the next one to come back to what we accomplished. Right? I mean, there's a lot more to this story, but it's really important for us to remember, in opposition to the social organization of forgetting that would ask us to forget about this history of AIDS activism, that we fought tooth and nail against the early homosexualization of AIDS, that it was actually from the grassroots up that we developed erotic positive safer sex practices, that it was we who provided support for people living with AIDS and HIV. And I'm using we as both a question that people can respond to, but also in the sense of trying to provide a point of identification that people can enter into and see ourselves as being actors in the historical process. That we provided incredible levels of support, and also through direct action, we actually pushed for and won greater treatment access. In that sense, we did actually establish, for many people, that direct action equals life. And I think that's really important for us to come back to. At a time when official AIDS organizing has been managed and contained, and tamed and sanitized in many, many different ways, it's really important for us to remember that we were able to act, we did change the world, we did make things better for lots of people, and we still have those capacities. That those capacities are still there, that we do have the possibility of acting, especially in relationship to direct action, to extend and broaden people's lives and to make the lives that people have far more rewarding and far more exciting and far more pleasure-filled and far more filled with delight. So with that, I just also want to thank a number of people. I want to thank Alexis, both for the wonderful introduction that of course embarrassed me before the talk, to the AIDS Activist History Project, which even though I sort of felt initially that Alexis had sort of roped me into it, I actually feel like this is wonderful for me to be able to remember in different ways and to actually be involved in this type of process of historical recovery, because AIDS activism was a very important part of my life. Also to the conference organizing committee, I want to also thank all of those who were involved in PWA coalitions, the ACT UP groups, and AIDS Action Now, including all of those people who have died. And I also want to thank my partner Patrick and our wonderful son Mike. And I want to leave you with this sort of famous or infamous image, because I think it helps us to realize that right now, still today, our bodies are still battlegrounds. And that our activism has to be bodily based, but that's something that can actually give us an awful lot of energy and dynamism. And also just remember that AIDS activism was never simply around mourning. It was never simply around pain. It was never simply around being depressed. It was also about acting and knowing that we could extend people's lives. So I just wanted to repeat at the very end the ACT UP slogan, silence equals death, but I'm going to modify it to direct action equals life. Thank you very much. I'm sure I've said something controversial, and I won't have to use my usual strategy of offering quarters to bribe people to ask questions. Sometimes works with students. So there is time for discussion, right?
Yeah.
I can't see any of you, so just yell it out or belt out whatever you want to say.
I have a question. So I think one of the things that I've been thinking about since I really share the sense of the centrality of fighting the social organization of forgetting, and I have a strong commitment to thinking about embodied being. And one of the things that I found really provocative, and also that I wasn't sure what to do with, was the idea that part of the resistance of the social organization of forgetting is bodily memory, especially for those of us, right? So I believe that memory is collective and relational. But most of the time there is still this sense that it's located in one's body, so that what you're doing is recovering a memory that you actually experienced. But it seems to me like if we're going to fight the social organization of forgetting, there's some way that that bodily memory has to be transmittable to people who weren't there. So I just wondered if you could talk about whether that's, or how you're thinking about bodies and memory for people who weren't there.
Yes, I think part of what we want to try to do with the AIDS Activist History Project is to produce ways and means through which people who weren't there can actually come to live, hopefully in a somewhat embodied way, what it was like to be there during the period that we're really covering, which is from the late 80s to probably about 1996. I think one of the things about queer liberation more generally, because it's about bodies and sex, even if some people want to deny that, right, especially in the era of same-sex marriage, is, and also in relationship to AIDS, which had to do with health and bodies, and what was going on with bodies, is that memory is actually quite interwoven with their experiences of our bodies. I mean, one of the things that actually poses a more radical question in terms of memory work is how to actually recover how it was in terms of our bodily experience. We became gendered, or we became racialized, or we became sexualized in particular types of ways. So I mean, that's really hard to recover, right? But it's something that we actually all need to do work on, because we're recovering not just individual idiosyncratic experiences, but something that's much more collective in character. So I think there's a generational question that's raised here that both the queer liberation movement has not been very good at, and the AIDS movement certainly hasn't been very good at, because the ways in which AIDS service organizations have been managed and regulated and contained is they're not at all interested in us knowing about ACT UP or AIDS Action Now or how our activism actually changed the world. So we're up against a lot, but I think it's really important for us to start, even if we're not fully convinced that we can do it, to recover those historical memories and make them available to people. And we have to do it in such ways that we resonate with the contradictions that people still experience today in terms of their bodies and lives, right? So I mean, one of the interesting things for me is for younger queer people who still experience profound forms of oppression and repression, and the adult gay movement hasn't actually addressed adequately at all, is that I think you actually see more openings to the possibilities of seeing things differently, but we have not been very successful at all in terms of getting these experiences and knowledge to them. So I think one of the interesting projects would be, coming out of the AIDS Activist History Project, maybe for some other people, is how to take this knowledge and make it much more communicable or translatable to younger queer people or people who are now HIV positive. How do we do that? I mean, there are various means and mechanisms through which that's been talked about, but I think that that's something we really need to work on. So in terms of bodies and memory, I've done a lot of oral historical work, right? So what is memory, right? It's a really interesting question. When you actually interview someone about the past, I'm pretty convinced through a lot of the interviews I've done that you're not sort of accessing some sort of spontaneous, instantaneous memory that they have, right? What you're actually accessing is how they processed, how they've made sense of, how they've spoken to other people about, how they've written down things about their experiences. That's what you're really accessing in terms of the social organization of memory. So from the very beginning then, that has a social collective character. Like, it's really different if you're talking to someone who's never thought about this since it happened to them. It's a very different type of interview to someone who, say, 3 months after something happened to them, wrote it down, right? You're actually accessing something very, very different. So memory is always social and historical in character, and oftentimes it has an embodied character, but it also has this relational, interactive character if what you're getting at is actually, how have I talked to other people about this in the past? How have how have I made sense of this? I think one of the things that the Act Up Oral History Project shows us is that the people's memories that they're getting narratives around are actually produced out of that social collective context of Act Up. Yes, they're individual stories, but it's not like this fragmented individual story. It's actually a collective story where people bring their idiosyncrasies and personal experiences into it. So I've given you a really rambling answer, but hopefully some elements actually relate to those questions. And I think those are actually also questions that we have to continue to explore. What is forgetting? What is memory? What is embodied knowing? What is an embodied memory? I mean, all of these things I think are really crucial. I do know that in the past, if I'd actually talked about George Smith, I would have cried, okay? I'm somehow past that, right? I mean, that to conjure up those memories of people who died can actually have an intense emotional reaction for me. So, I mean, but it's, in a certain sense, it's talking more about that has both, it's weird because it's made me more emotionally distanced from it, but it's also allowed me to probably be able to communicate better. Like, I'm sure if I broke down crying in front of you, you would say, yeah, that's really like weird, like that's not what usually happens, but I wouldn't have been as successful at communicating what I was trying to do. So, but if you want me to cry, I'll try to do it.
But just communicate something different.
Yeah. Then, yeah, go ahead, go for it.
My name's Alex.
Yeah, I can see it.
I'm quite actively involved in AIDS Action Now, as you know, today. So first of all, I want to thank you for your comments, and I think it's fascinating how little of what you presented I know. And so as someone who's like very active in AIDS Action Now today, and it's fascinating the practice of forgetting that happens so quickly, even in our own communities. And I work with people who were there in the back then, like Tim McCaskill, and but just even intergenerationally, how much has been lost. So at first, I want to thank you for undertaking this project. I also have like some fears or concerns about it, and I just in my own, like, it makes me anxious, this project of historicization, because I have like a lot invested in not in that past, but in like the present of AIDS activism. And I think I'm wondering if you could reflect on any kind of dangers or fears you can see in terms of what happened in the project of historicizing the AIDS movement. Wasn't very articulate. Do you know what I'm getting at?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's sort of two questions I sort of see there. One is, what is the relationship between the historical past and the historical present? So in terms of our relationship with AIDS Action Now as the AIDS Activist History Project, one of the things that the AIDS Action Now Steering Committee made really clear to us was, yeah, we're interested in that, but we're actually more interested in how this relates to our organizing right now against the criminalization of HIV. So we've actually facilitated, and there's a forum being organized in Toronto next Friday night, to actually try to recover some of those historical narratives and memories about both opposition to some of the public health measures, including quarantine measures, but also early criminalization attempts. So we're trying to make as relevant as possible the work of historical recovery to the struggles and needs of people in the historical present. So I think that's one of our commitments. I think there's always a danger when you're trying to do the histories of any form of activism, of a whole series of limitations and dangers. Like, who are you going to talk to? Whose stories are going to be recorded? How is that going to be used? A whole series of questions, right? Like, so one of the questions that Alexis and I are grappling with now is there were also major debates and struggles within AIDS Action Now at particular moments, right? How do we address that in terms of the historical work that we're doing? And we're also not trying in a monological way to say this is that history. In fact, we're not actually trying to write the history of AIDS activism. We're trying to develop resources for people who want to find out about what happened in terms of AIDS activism in Toronto, using as our entry point AIDS Action Now, in Halifax, using as our entry point the PWA Coalition and the ACT UP group there. In Ottawa, we're not quite clear, but there was an ACT UP group here for a while. In Montreal, it will be Reaction CEDA, ACT UP Montreal, and other groups. And in Vancouver, it will be the PWA Coalition and the ACT UP group there. So we're going to use those as initial starting points, but we know it's going to go far beyond that. But it's going to have to be selective. We don't have tons of funding. Ideally, what I'd really like to come out of this project is activist history research groups in all of the centers that we're doing work in that can continue this type of project and activity after we're finished with what we can do. So, I mean, I actually see it in that sense as not trying to write the history, which is not at all what we want to do, but to make available historical resources that are also incredibly relevant to the struggles today. So that's sort of what the project is. Again, the limitations of that can be quite profound, right? So I think we're quite aware of the dangers of like only recording sort of like the experiences of white men in relationship to AIDS activism, and the need to include very varied experiences around gender, racialization, and class. The question, though, is how to actually bring that about. So we would also really want to encourage dialogue and debate with people who are currently involved in AIDS activism, and also any sort of suggestions or contributions people have on who you think we should talk to try and broaden out what we're doing. We've also sort of been, like there's many people in AIDS service organizations who've approached us about wanting to do their histories, and we're just having to say no, right? There should be other resources you can get. It's not that it's unimportant, it's just not what we're doing. And we need to have some sort of focus on AIDS activism and direct action politics to sort of try to orient our work. Not that we're using direct action politics in the sense that if you didn't organize a sit-in, we're not going to talk to you, right? But this broader sense of direct action politics. So I hope that helps a bit. We also hope that there can sort of be dialogues at a number of points throughout our doing this research where people can actually challenge us or try to redirect what we're doing if people feel like it's not going in the best possible ways. That's something we haven't really talked about, but I just broached it now. So.
Can I say one, just because you're also sort of asking about the project, and we haven't talked about what I'm about to say either. But I think, you know, one of my provocations for wanting to do this was reading a lot of the histories that were coming out. About 4 years ago, I started reading some of the work that Sarah and Jim was doing, and found it really generative and like important to impart. I had a lover in New York who was doing work with GNHC and trying to think about some of the things that she was thinking about and talking about. And then I was also very irritated that it was so New York centric, and I think this is something that a lot of people share. And at the same time, I felt this incredible generosity of having many, many things available, many, many perspectives on that work, that it was in some ways very determined, because Sarah in these interviews is a really opinionated interviewer in a way that I can't imagine ever being. I would say this to her, she would hear. I feel like I'm talking behind her back. But that there's a proliferation, right, instead of a closing down. And also, I guess I sort of plan for us to just fail a lot in a way that will open things for other people, right? And so I'm trying to think about the kind of necessary failure as a practice of generosity. Yeah.
Other things, come on. Must be something. Yeah, go for it.
I just have a question of a general interest. I know you were located in Toronto, and very separated from it. And I mean, I also noticed that it was called the Montreal Manifesto, right? And I'm just wondering, oftentimes political movement can vary depending on where you are. And of course, in Vancouver might be different from Toronto, might be different from Montreal. Right? But I'm particularly interested in Quebec. And did you, while this movement was picking up, did you notice, differences between Quebec and the way that people were organizing in Toronto, for example, in terms of like, the French culture or questions around sovereignty or this kind of resistance of Quebec to do things differently than federal government in the rest of Canada? French-speaking activists and English-speaking activists working together, sometimes that creates tensions and sometimes it works beautifully. But what was your experience of that? If you could speak to that.
Yeah, so I mean, it was called the Montreal Manifesto simply because the International AIDS Conference was there. And it was translated into French, I think, by Bernard Court, who used to be a Montreal gay activist who became part of AIDS Action now in Toronto. I'm pretty sure about that. And Reaction SIDA, which was the AIDS activist group in Montreal that we were working with, was actually not involved in writing the Montreal Manifesto because we only got in contact with them closer to the time of the conference itself. Reaction SIDA was partially francophone, but mostly anglophone group. So I mean, this is the whole history of organizing with some relationship to Quebec has always been complicated or enriched by questions of national oppression and questions of language, right? So what is interesting is that there didn't seem to be the same development of a sort of somewhat treatment-based AIDS activism in Montreal, in the same way as in Toronto. There was a Montreal ACT UP chapter formed after the '89 International AIDS Conference. Interesting enough, that was largely from a number of the boyfriends that people from ACT UP had made while they were in Montreal for a period of time, which may give you an interesting idea of how to proliferate forms of organization, right? If your project is, I'm going to have sex with so many people and they're all going to become members of ACT UP when we leave, which I'm sure was not specifically the project that was in mind, but in some ways it was the outcome. I think the history of the sort of community-based AIDS service organizations in Montreal is rather different from Toronto. There's questions of language, but I think there's also questions of what it meant for these, and this is work that Ross Higgins in particular has done about Montreal, what it meant for certain people in the gay community to suddenly have access to really large amounts of money, and what that led to in the transformation of relationships within Montreal. So there's language questions for sure. I really can't relate it to the sort of national question. That specifically, certainly that was a major issue in terms of lesbian and gay organizing in the 70s, was over whether to support self-determination for Quebec or not. And it was only after the Parti Québécois government very quietly passed sexual orientation protection in 1977, after the Trucks riot or rebellion, that things sort of shifted. So like, how can we deny self-determination to the one area that's actually passed sexual orientation protection? That begins to change a bit. So there's that whole history, but I think there needs to be a much broader process of historical recovery of this. So I would suggest looking at some of the work of Ross Higgins in terms of trying to look at the specific dynamics of the AIDS service organization development in Montreal and Quebec much more generally, and I really don't have an awful lot of knowledge about that. It's also one of the, I mean, we're having some discussions about how to actually approach Montreal. We know it's really crucial in terms of AIDS activist history, but it's both questions of language as well as questions of where to start. Because Reaction SIDA did not last for very long, and either did ACT UP Montreal. I mean, these were not sort of like organizations that had a long staying power. Although we can identify individuals within them who are important places to start to do the interviews we want to do. So it was a really good question, but I think it's something we need to try to answer as we move along, or other people can use the information and stories we collect to try to begin to address some of these questions.
It's still anger and rage that fuels your activism?
Fuels my activism? I should maybe qualify some of the stuff about anger and rage. It's anger and rage when you know that it can actually lead you somewhere, right? So like using anger and rage in relationship to direct action and knowing in your body, right? That's part of why direct action is so important to me. I know in my body, not just sort of intellectually, theoretically, that direct action gets people many of the things they need. We actually got people access to treatments that pharmaceutical corporations did not want them to have access to, and governments did not want to have them have access to through direct action. And it was in some ways anger and rage that initially got people engaged in that. I've most recently been largely involved in anti-poverty direct action activism, and certainly there's a lot of anger and rage there. although it's less directly experienced by me as not someone who actually lives in poverty. But certainly that helps to get people involved. But I would actually say much more what inspires me politically is knowing that there are effective forms of action that you can engage in that can actually dramatically improve people's lives and can actually begin to transform the relationships in which we find ourselves. I think that's what really drives me. So just, the story from early on in the Sudbury Coalition Against Poverty's history was, we called up and said this person's been denied their social assistance check, and we were told, there's no way in hell you're going to get this check, right? We sent 10 or 15 people down there, and by that afternoon, that person had the check, right? So knowing that is quite an incredible experience. Like once you actually have felt or tasted what direct action politics can lead to, it really can provide a lot of sustaining power, right? If you know that, I may not be able to bring about, quote, the revolution tomorrow, and I think a revolution actually is much more complex than like the moment of insurrection. But I can actually be involved with other people in forms of activism that can actually make a real difference and can at least point us in a prefigurative way towards what another type of society might look like, and to actually build new and different types of social relationships between people. That's what really inspires me these days. And I actually have to say that even though I learned about direct action politics and AIDS Action Now, I've been much more committed and much more immersed in it in terms of anti-poverty activism. I've learned far more about it in that context, and it's partly to do with what's happened to AIDS organizing since, in some ways, the early 1990s with earlier roots than that, just of being very contained, very managed, where I think AIDS service organizations in some ways have become part of the regulatory policing regime that many people living with AIDS and HIV have to confront in their everyday lives. And they have to confront them to get certain things, but they're not directly of assistance to people in many situations. Again, not to deny the good work and the good efforts of lots of people who do work in AIDS service organizations, but I think many people living with AIDS and HIV have actually come to encounter them as roadblocks, right? Necessary roadblocks, but roadblocks nonetheless. Again, I'm ranting, so I'm just
You're mentioning that you were unsure of where to start in Montreal, and then before you were talking about these individuals as being access points to the history in that one book that was being made, and I know that you have your first couple of interviews coming up next week. I was wondering who they are. You don't have to give me their names, but is there like a specific reason that you chose them as the entry point to the research project, and was that a self-conscious choice, or was it just convenience, or where did you choose, where and how did you choose to start this massive?
Well, I think insofar as we've had a collective discussion around this, it was that we're only going to do work on 5 centers, so Toronto, Halifax, Ottawa, Montreal, and Vancouver. Montreal and Vancouver we're leaving till later. And what we have our method has been, we're going to start with people who were involved, people who are still around, who were involved in particular forms of organizing. So Toronto AIDS Action Now is our entry point, and we know that then ties us into a whole series of other things. I already mentioned Voices of Positive Women, Hassan, there's a whole series of other, Katie, there's a whole series of other organizations that emerge out of that. And in Halifax, we're going to start with the PWA Coalition and the ACT UP group there. Unfortunately, Eric Smith, when I did a preliminary interview with him, showed me a picture of the founding members of the PWA Coalition in Nova Scotia, and aside from himself and Maureen Shabib, a legal supporter of them, none of them are still alive, right? But there's entry points there, and also the ACT UP group in Halifax. And so we're going to try to use that method. So within that context, we want to interview as many individuals as possible. So just in terms of AIDS Action Now, we haven't really talked about this, but like there could be a pool of at least 40 people to start with, right? And that would be like the first wave of interviews, and then to move beyond that. The other thing is we also want to build into this project ways in which people who died are actually remembered as well. So for instance, with AIDS Action Now, we've talked about organizing a social event some evening where people who were around in AIDS Action Now at that time will bring photos pieces of writing, memories of people who died, and try to figure out how we can actually record that and preserve it so that the historical memories also about the people who died as well as those who lived. I don't think I'm going to mention all the particular individuals we're going to be interviewing next weekend in Toronto, but we want to interview like people who were connected in various different ways with a group like AIDS Action Now. So not just people who were centrally involved, but people who might have been involved around particular activities or particular actions, and also people who've always been there but have not been people who've ever been focused on. So we want to make absolutely clear that we cover a vast range of people who were involved in different ways in these groups. I hope that helps a bit.
Yeah. I guess I'm also just interested in how, like the networks that you get from the people that you begin with affect the direction that the research will take, and ultimately also affect the people that end up getting left out.
Yeah, and that's always a question in terms of interview-based research. But we've also got suggestions, like one of the things we did when we met with the AIDS Action Now Steering Committee was to say, like, do you have suggestions on people we should talk to? And there were actually a whole bunch of names that came up there that I wouldn't have thought of. My involvement in AIDS Action Now really ends in major ways in 1990, and I actually become an AIDS activist of a very different sort in St. John's, Newfoundland, and in the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia for a number of years, right? So I actually get dislocated from AIDS Action Now. So my memories and my connections are actually quite limited in terms of the entire history of AIDS Action Now, which is why I sort of stopped where I did in relationship to AIDS Action Now. There's an awful lot to be learned. So we want to be as open-ended and diverse as we can, but we also can't do everything. So you're right. At some point, there's actually questions about who you're going to interview and who you're not, and where you're going to look and where you can't look, just because of time and energy. And that's an unfortunate thing, which is one of the reasons why I think we want to, I'm sure at the end of this, we're not going to say this is finished. We're going to say we've done what we can. We hope that other people can come forward to move this on, to continue it and to, in some ways, complete it.
I'm wondering if you could talk about the decision around how you define what is activism, and you kind of talked about this around defining direct action, because I guess in the early days of the epidemic, which I wasn't around in, just distributing information about how to stay alive was important. Even sharing condoms or safer sex was highly politicized act, right? Of community self-care and mutual aid. I'm wondering what, like, in terms of defining things through that people had to participate in direct action, it takes a certain type of individual or group to feel entitled enough to participate or privileged enough or have the time enough to participate in direct action activist work. And I'm wondering what could get lost through defining activism in such a way. And I'm thinking about potentially like people in prison who distribute needles to each other against the will of the warden, which isn't direct action, but it's like a subversive act to support and save each other's lives. I'm wondering what could get lost through defining activism in a certain way,
Yeah, there's two aspects to this, because there's also a time framework question that we're using to try to construct at least some permeable boundaries around what we're doing.